Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder.
Craig Laurance Gidney is the author of Sea Swallow Me and Other Stories, Skin Deep Magic, Bereft, a YA novella, and A Spectral Hue, a novel. He has been a Lambda Literary finalist 3 times, was a Carl Brandon Parallax Award finalist, and won the inaugural Joseph S. Pulver Senior Award for Weird Fiction. The Nectar of Nightmares is his most recent collection. He lives in Washington, D.C.
Thanks for joining us, Craig.
I notice in a lot of your fiction, your characters kind of see this shimmery noumena. Your characters perceive something either on the outskirts of reality or outside of reality or invisible to others within reality. Do you think that's something you have always found a use within fiction for?
What I have discovered is that what I am interested in is what I'd like to call dark wonder. I like the sort of numiniousness of the world and the sort of liminality of things too. And so that's, for me, the thing with writing and reading too, is that I'm more reaching for that sort of eerie, hair on the back of the hand feeling. Like the characters come later, but it's always that sort of weird mood that I'm always looking for. And part of it probably has to do with wanting to escape from how horrible life can be. And that's kind of how I view writing. So it's both cathartic and also, I think in some ways, it's a beacon for other people who are kind of misfits or kind of feel alienated from modern life in many ways.
You write very well about misfits, people who are kind of perceptive to the edges of things that others are maybe not picking up on. This kind of like hypersensitivity too, which to me seems like a good metaphor for the artist or for the writer. Is that a kind of metaphoric thing that you're conscious of in your work? I guess I'm thinking specifically of A Spectral Hue, but also a lot of the stories in Sea Swallow Me.
There's definitely a through line I found. A lot of my characters are marginalized by various things, whether it's by race or sexuality, or sometimes they're poets. For instance, I wrote a story about Arthur Rimbaud. He was outside of bourgeois French society, shall we say. And that's kind of my through line.
I can see that. I must say, I think my favorite thing I've read from you, please tell me if I'm mispronouncing the title. Is it Etiolate?
Yes, that's it.
I loved that story. I enjoy all your writing, but there's a certain way in which that piece, I guess it's doing a lot of the things that I see in your fiction in a very distilled and hyper vivid way. There's the sort of excess embodied experience of this clubbing world and then these kind of erotic encounters. And you do a really interesting thing throughout the story where the erotic tilts over into the horrific, but there's also this element of excessive beauty in those horrific moments too. Like when his lover explodes, there's something kind of like almost like a Jackson Pollock painting or something. I'd love to hear a little bit about how that story developed.
When I published that book, or that particular story, I gave the book to my mother and I said, read every story except this one, because I think it was a bit too much for her. And, she decided not to read that. I was just like, no, you won't like that because it's sexy and violent and all that. And one of the things that I wanted to capture in this story, and I don't know if I was thinking about it consciously, but I wanted to capture, I am fascinated with the line between beauty and horror. I'm not a big gore hound, but I love vivid imagery. I love dark imagery. I have this viewpoint that the supernatural, when it comes, it's enticing. I mean, no one is going to, I mean, no offense to people who like Cthulhu and Lovecraft, but my thing is, I don't think people would gravitate towards a squid-faced monster. They'd go towards an eerie marsh flower and discover that it has like other powers. There is a sort of a grayness about this. So the character in that story kind of enjoys the horror that happens as much as he's horrified by it. He's both enchanted and disgusted by it. And that sort of push me, pull me thing is the sort of thing about horror that really is the heart of what I would call Gidney horror.
I too am not a gore hound, as you say. And I relate to a lot of your subject matter in The Nectar of Nightmares. Like, I grew up reading myth and fairy tale, and Mike and I often talk about whimsy and menace, which is kind of like beauty and horror, as you were saying, the dark wonder of the world. The world is kind of cruel and mysterious, and you have to find the beauty in that to keep on keeping on. Yeah, I was drawn to things like Bluebeard, or like, there's some of the Brothers Grimm were really violent in this kind of more magical way. And so I'm wondering, like, what did you grow up reading, and where did this kind of particular Gidney brand horror come from?
Well, this is an interesting question, Miriam, because it's actually funny. It actually partially comes from the late Shelley Duvall. Shelley Duvall passed away. And back when there were video rentals, I would get her fairy tale theater stuff. And a lot of that stuff doesn't really hold up now because of the effects are sort of like chroma key and that sort of thing. But Duvall really had an interest in exploring the darker side of fairy tales as much as she was the whimsy. And that sort of thing really fascinated me. And then I sort of came into horror by way of, I'd say, fantasy. And when I discovered that there was such a thing as fairy tale fiction, my mind was blown. And I was just like, oh, because there's Angela Carter, there's Tanith Lee, there's tons of people that sort of use folklore, and they're just beautiful and terrible at the same time. And I've always loved that. Speaking of, for instance, one of the stories in The Nectar of Nightmares was a folk tale that I retold called Beneath the Briar Patch. And what I wanted to do with that particular thing was that I kind of wanted to introduce cosmic horror into a African American folktale setting. And so it's sort of like rescuing Uncle Remus from its questionable past. I'm not fond of how Joel Chandler Harris collected those stories. It was very condescending the way that he treated those folk tales. So I kind of wanted to take those folk tales and sort of resurrect the horror that lives within them, and resurrect the wonder too, the whimsy too. And so it's a Brer Rabbit story, it's a trickster story. It's also a story about this deposed African sort of figure, John the Root Conqueror, and how he lives beneath the briar patch. And so I smashed those two things together. Another thing that I did in Nectar of Nightmares was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. First of all, I made it homoerotic, and I also leaned into the more horror side of it. What if there was an actual beast, the body horror of it and all.
I feel like part of what you're describing is the kind of creative act of reclamation in a way. You're like reclaiming these stories as well as repurposing them. There's something very generative in that approach to narrative. That's fascinating.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important too, particularly when I did the Grimm's retelling, is that part of my thing is that that's part of my culture too. And a lot of people were like, you can only write African American or African style fantasy. And I'm like, no, I don't have to, because that's a part of my cultural background too, because I'm culturally Western, that's the way it is. And I just filter it through a particular lens.
I guess something else you said earlier that amused me was when you gave your mom the copy of Sea Swallow Me saying, don't read this story. I do the same thing with my collections with my mom. She says, tell me which stories I can read.
Right, exactly.
There's always a sticky note in the book. I'm like, do not read this one, this one, this one. But
right, exactly.
But that had me thinking about this dilemma that I've often had to bump up against as a writer, and I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts. How important is it to you to think about the reader when you're writing? Like, are you able to write while thinking about a hypothetical reader, or is that something you need to try to avoid? Because I know, for instance, thinking about one's mom would prevent one from going down a lot of different avenues.
Right.
Right? So, yeah, I don't know.
Exactly.
How do you balance that as a writer?
Well, I'd say that the first draft, maybe even the second draft, are purely for me. And then when I'm thinking about selling it, that's when I go through with a fine-tooth comb and figure out what works, what doesn't work, what is unclear, and which audience it properly needs to go to. I'd say a lot of the sort of sexy stuff, I put it in the first draft, and it's some of the more gory stuff, even though I don't write a lot of gory stuff. A lot of the gory stuff goes in, it's like kitchen sink approach. And then I go through and figure out and filter and do all that work.
The process you're describing reminds me of a Stephen King quote: write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open.
That's
when
a
you
beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, he knows.
Yeah.
He's got those pithy
Because you
statements.
kind of have to go there, or at least I have to go there. I have to, either be completely disgusted or laughing hysterically or something. And then you sort of reshape it so that it's more sellable and more understandable.
Do you have like a trusted group of first readers that help you to get it to that more marketable, or would you just have an editor that you work with?
I do have people who I do send stories to, who I trust, and who tell me, this is unclear, or this particular phrase is a little overwrought. The thing that's difficult is that you have to find someone who both loves your work and is critical of it, and you don't always get that, and you have to figure out who's the right person, because, if you give it to a friend, sometimes it's like, oh, I love it, there's nothing wrong with it, and I'm like, I don't trust you. I've done workshops like Clarion West, and one of the things that I got from that particular thing was some people will never get your work. I don't want to say your opinion is completely worthless, but sometimes, someone, it's not for them. And you have to figure out the right balance to find the person who is both critical and also understands what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had that experience in workshops too. The most frequent one that I always have to shut out of my brain when I'm writing is like people saying, oh, I had to look that word up in the dictionary. And it's like, well, words are beautiful, words are fun. Most writers I know love language. So, I mean, congratulations. You had to look it up in the dictionary. You learned a new word. It's how I feel. So, yes, I relate to you, Craig.
Yeah. Going on to, workshopping, I wonder if you've all had this similar experience. When I started writing in college, there was a no science fiction, no horror, nothing fantastic thing. And, I did write, and I still do write realistic mimetic fiction. But there was one professor I remember very clearly. She was one of the people that just was like, you don't have any showy language at all. You have no imagery. It's just blump, 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 blump. It's very, what is his name? Raymond Carver way of writing, which is that if the character is, let's say the character doesn't read, they're not going to necessarily make, a lot of the same symbolic suggestions that you would make as a writer. And that's a good way to write in some senses, but in other senses, it doesn't work. There's this guy named Nathan Ballingrud. He actually writes that sort of Raymond Carver-esque way, but he does it in such a way that it works for him. I wouldn't say that he's a minimalist. It's just that he's very precise in what he does. I am more of a maximalist in terms of because I don't do drugs or anything, and I don't drink a whole lot. So writing and language is kind of where I get my trips. And I love that sort of trippy sort of thing. And so as a result, a lot of my writing is very trippy. I mean, the secret is not to make it too trippy so that it's completely, incomprehensible. But
one of the things I was noticing was the way you write vivid sensory details. And not only that, but you often play with the blurring of senses. I noticed a kind of synesthesia-like quality to some of your description. I wanted to read a passage actually from The Safety of Thorns, which is a story in your collection, See Swallow Me, and then pick your brain about it.
Okay.
The quote is, "This song was dark and hot, the sulfur stink of the bayou in it. It oozed over him like soft black mud at the bottom of a creek," unquote. It feels to me like you often use the senses both to orient the reader in your stories, but you're also using them to defamiliarize at the same time, which is a tricky balance. So you make these sensory reactions hallucinatory in a way. I wanted to ask you, Craig, how you think about writing the senses, especially as a maximalist writer, as you describe yourself. And I do see that description makes sense to me.
Well, I have a secret power, which is that I can taste prose. So I am kind of synesthetic. When I read things, there are certain prose styles, like for instance, there's an author named Jonathan Carroll. He tastes like celery. I can't explain it, but there's some crispness about the writing, and I just can taste it on my tongue. And that's kind of what I'm going for. Because part of the magic of writing is that you can put your thoughts in somebody else's head. And I absolutely adore that. And I absolutely adore the fact that you can derange the senses, as Rimbaud once said in his poem, that you sort of derange the senses. And I love that aspect of it. So that's kind of where I'm going with the sort of sensory overload with my writing, is that it's kind of how I experience language at very least, and the world in some greater senses.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for your writing, because we've noticed that color plays a massive role in your fiction. For example, your novel, A Spectral Hue, takes its title from a pinkish purplish color that shows up again and again in the works of Black Maryland artists. You're talking about taste. Is color something similar? Like, how do you conceptualize the role of color in speculative fiction or in fiction writing more broadly?
With A Spectral Hue, for instance, when I started writing it way back, it was written like 20 years ago, and rewritten and rewritten. And part of what I wanted to capture was the fact that the essence of that sort of weird pinkish purple color, I kind of wanted to make it a character of its own. I mean, I absolutely adore color, and I absolutely adore painting, and I love that sort of thing. And I would say that my interest in color too is that, how do I explain this? In some senses, I think the best way to describe this is sometimes when I write something, I don't view it as that I'm writing something as much as I can't write music, so I write instead. I can't, play an instrument, so I do this instead. that's kind of what it goes through, is that I love painted scenes. And I'm sort of sad that it's kind of not very fashionable these days, you know? I wrote a young adult novel called Bereft, and one of the struggles I had was a lot of young adult novels are kind of written in a very plain style. And particularly if they're contemporary, you have to learn all these slang words and things like that, things that I'm just not that interested in. So for Bereft, what I did is that I weaved in a sort of rich dream life into the character's life. And it helped to sort of balance out that the LOLs and the sort of contemporary terms that I just am now learning from my niece and nephew, you know. If you write young adult, you have to keep up with that. I'm just like, at a certain point, I'm just like, I'm too old to know what Riz. I mean, I know what Riz is, but but they had to tell me,
I don't think I know what that is, and I just finished writing a novel about teenage editors a couple of years ago. So
It means charisma.
thank you. Okay, I'm I'm stowing that away.
I'm just like, what do you mean, Riz? And when you write young adult novels, don't you find that you have to remember that young adults aren't into, like, let's say, Ani DeFranco or something. It's like, oh, when I was a teenager, I was into Bauhaus and all this. It's like, no, they aren't. They're into like Lil Wayne and Lil Pump and all these things. And you're just like, I don't have time to learn all this stuff.
Yeah,
Would you
true.
ever consider writing something set, like kind of, I guess, retro, like set in the past of your youth as a workaround? I know some people do that so that they can.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's what I do. I'd set it in the 70s or the 80s or something.
I thought it was really interesting looking at your Goodreads profile list of influences. You mentioned the great writers James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, Tanith Lee, and Franz Kafka. So I kind of wanted to pick your brain about what some of your favorite books by these writers might be, how the writers influenced you, and if there's anyone else you would add to that list that have had a big impact on you as a stylist, as a world builder.
I guess I want to start with Toni Morrison. The first novel of hers that I read, which is not my favorite novel, but it really grabbed me, was this novel called Tar Baby. It was kind of her attempt at a contemporary romance novel, but it was so fucking weird. I remember my mother, going back to my mother again, I remember my mother read that for her book club because she was used to sort of bodice rippers or those sort of spicy romance novels, Harlequin romances and things like that. And she was just like, what is all this with all these spirits and this symbol and all these weird characters appearing? And I read it and I was just like, I absolutely adore this. So she's kind of pushed me towards the maximalist way of writing, actually. And then I think somewhere around 18, I discovered Tanith Lee. And I remember the way that I discovered it. There's a science fiction writer named Michael Swanwick, and he wrote a review of one of her books of short fiction in the Washington Post. And I'll never forget the line that he used. He said, I love the marvelous joinery of her sentences. So I ran out and I got the first Tanith Lee that I could get. And what happened was they didn't have the book that he mentioned. Instead, they had this new book that had just come out called Delirium's Mistress. So I bought this book, and I remember I was going to a job that was in a really rough area of DC. And I was reading this book on this bus, and I was completely transported. And I was just like, are you allowed to do that? Are you allowed to actually have beautiful language? And if you're familiar with Tanith Lee at all, in the first like page, there's like gay sex. And I was just like, what? And I was looking around the bus trying like, what am I reading? And it was just absolutely amazing. Another author that influenced me, and I actually ended up being his student, was Samuel R. Delany. And Delany is African American science fiction writer. And I would say that he is absolutely a maximalist in the way that he writes, because it's very experimental. It's very challenging to read his stuff because everything has different layers. When I was like 10, I actually found a copy of his sort of masterwork, Dhalgren, because my brother had it. And I remember reading parts of it. And first of all, it's very explicit. If you know Samuel Delany at all, he doesn't shy away from talking about BDSM or any of those sorts of things. And probably 10 years old is not a good idea to read it, but my parents, you know, it was TV that was against the law. You couldn't watch or something. You couldn't watch a certain thing. But books, they were like, oh, it's a book. Well, how bad could it be? So I read all sorts of things. I remember reading Samuel Delany, and Dhalgren has like nested stories within stories. It has a plague journal laid next to like a straightforward narrative. It opens with an unfinished sentence and ends with an unfinished sentence. It's almost like if James Joyce decided to write science fiction, is the best way I could describe it. Like Finnegan's Wake, but in science fiction. I went to a college called Hampshire College, and we were a part of a consortium, and I got to take a course at UMass Amherst where he was teaching. It was amazing. The way that that happened is kind of funny. I had signed up for a course with James Baldwin because James Baldwin was teaching at UMass, and it was one of the reasons why I went to Hampshire so that I could take a part of it, because he would hop around from various universities in the consortium. So he would teach at Hampshire, he would teach at UMass, Mount Holyoke, Smith. So I signed up for a course of his. Unfortunately, he passed away before I could do it. And I was just like, ugh. And then it said, well, Samuel Delany is teaching it. I'm like, oh. So that was just absolutely amazing to be able to work with him.
Do you ever feel like there's an alternate you who learned from James Baldwin instead of Samuel Delany and therefore has a different style, or do you not put so much stock in influence?
You know, the thing about James Baldwin is I think he's a maximalist in his own way, meaning that when you read his stuff, it's pages and pages and pages of description. What I kind of got from him is kind of what I got from Octavia Butler, which is a sense of using fiction to talk about certain social issues. I think that I might be more of a social justice writer if I followed James Baldwin, maybe, but I don't know. I have no way of knowing.
Was there anything in particular that you learned from Samuel Delany that was like really helpful or informative for your writing?
He taught me how to sort of think about everything about fiction, particularly about how to do point of view, how to create a character. He taught me that it's okay to write about uncomfortable subjects and how to do it really well. I think that a lot of science fiction and fantasy, particularly of science fiction and fantasy of the 70s, the new wave, when they kind of went nuts and started like M. John Harrison and all these people, and even Ursula Le Guin, I actually low key think that they were failed horror writers or secret horror, closet horror writers in many ways. Because if you read his stuff, And you read some stuff by James Tiptree, for instance. A lot of it is, horrific if you think about it. And it's about changing bodies and changing social structures. And there's a certain thriller aspect of it that I think a lot of people sort of don't pay attention to. I think a lot of people are closet horror writers, to tell the truth.
One of the things I mentioned to you when I first emailed you about this interview is that your fiction has a kind of genre slippery quality. And I love that about genre,
Mhm.
that is, right? They are kind of slippery often. One bleeds into another. Sometimes it's difficult to parse where one subgenre begins and another ends. Giovanni's Room and If Beale Street Could Talk are two of my favorite novels. Were there any particular Baldwin books that really made an impression on you? You were talking about his kind of maximalist perspective in some ways. Were there specific books that you went to and thought, yes, that really speaks to me?
Go Tell It from the Mountain, and a lot of his short fiction too. And he did pare it back somewhat during the short fiction, but it's because it's short fiction, it's a different style, but it still comes through. Those were the two things that influenced me of his.
Earlier, you mentioned the kind of music of language, or this idea of writing as music. Like your collection, See Swallow Me, is named after that amazing song by Cocteau Twins and Harold Budd. The collection also has references to everything from Miles Davis, Aphex Twin, Nine Inch Nails, Coil. I was wondering if you listen to music while writing or editing, and if so, if you have specific go-to like writing albums or artists.
Oh, absolutely. What I usually write to is ambient music. I can't write to music that has lyrics because then I immediately start getting interested in the lyrics. Even if it's like Cocteau Twins and there's no lyrics and it's just weird, I still pay attention to it. So it has to be instrumental. One of the go-to when I'm trying to get into the Numenius is this band called Boren and Der Club of Gore. They do this stuff called doom jazz, and it is a cross between ambient music and sort of late night jazz, and there's like saxophones, and it's really cinematic, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Brian Eno stuff sort of helped too. A lot of Harold Budd stuff without the vocals and things. I sometimes turns to jazz. I love this. It's not Coltrane, but Coltrane's wife, Alice Coltrane. She was basically the Yoko Ono of jazz. So a lot of people didn't like her, but I love her because she is a jazz harpist. I don't know how it just sounds completely alien when she plays it. You just go into another world when she plays her music. She plays piano and harp at the same time. She's a multi-instrumental, or was a multi-instrumentalist. And she was absolutely amazing. And a lot of times when I'm sort of setting a scene, there is always an ambient thing that's going through my head. Maybe I might want to capture a chord and then I'll listen to that song and then write to that chord. It's kind of a mess, to tell the truth.
I definitely need to check out Alice Coltrane. I think the harp is the most whimsical of all the instruments personally, and I have never heard any harp jazz in my life.
There's Dorothy Ashby as another harpist too. And then, a lot of stuff like from my parents' generation. My mother grew up with this singer named Nina Simone. They were from the same town. They actually did something in high school, something where Nina played piano and then she was known as Eunice, but she played piano. My mother did some dramatic reading, and that also influenced me as well because she mixed classical music and sort of R&B music together and social justice lyrics at the same time. So she was a very complex character.
You mentioned your mom did dramatic reading. Are you from a writerly family? Have you always known that you wanted to be a writer?
I've always wanted to be a writer. My mother was a big reader, so she instilled that in me. She wasn't a writer necessarily. My father was a dentist, and so I had the best of both worlds, sort of like the thoughtful dentist part and the sort of flyaway mother part. So sort of arty things. My father wanted me to become a dentist, which was unfortunate because I don't like teeth. I mean, I like having them, but going into somebody's mouth is not my idea of a good time. It's my idea of a horror movie.
I think you said you were reading Tanith Lee when you were 10. Is that the one you said you were reading at that age?
No, that was Samuel Delany. See,
That was Samuel Delany. Okay.
My brother had bought the book and he had it laying around, so I snatched it up and I was just like, oh my God, what are you reading? And that's how that came apart.
You were reading some of these authors quite young, like Delany, for instance. I was curious to hear who some of your other first literary loves were. Like, what were some of the books that first got you excited about reading and writing?
I think when I started seriously reading, when I decided that I was going to be a writer, I started reading the Southern Gothics. So I started with Flannery O'Connor, and I absolutely love her work, but she's one of those characters like Howard P. Lovecraft, in that I might like the work, but they don't like me back. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that you kind of have to deal with. I will tell you this story. My younger brother, was really into heavy metal back in the 80s, 90s. And a lot of heavy metal artists decided to take images from Lovecraft. Like they would do concept albums about Cthulhu and all that sort of thing. So I remember I picked up a collection of that my brother had bought of Howard Lovecraft. And I read one story that was absolutely amazing. It was called The Outsider. I never forgot it. It was
Oh,
numinous and magical and beautiful. And I was just like, oh, this is so beautiful. And then the next story was something like the opening line was, I was talking to my black cat, inward man, and I threw the book across the room. I was just like, what? It was totally like, and I realized that, he was a monster kind of in many
yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
And I found that out about Flannery O'Connor Flannery O'Connor, brilliant writer, but she did not like James Baldwin at all. She hated James Baldwin. She was just like, I don't want to meet. And I'm just like, I tried to figure out why. My theory is that she didn't like James Baldwin because she didn't like educated Black people. She liked Black people in their places. And if you read her books, a lot of people of color are ciphers. They're not really characters at all. They're just symbols. And she was progressive for her particular milieu, I would say. I don't think she was against civil rights. She just thought everything had a certain order. And, you sometimes can't escape where you live, you know. So Flannery O'Connor was one of the people. William Faulkner. I loved William Faulkner. I started reading Franz Kafka because of Flannery O'Connor, because actually Kafka was one of the influences that she had. I went and discovered mostly his short fiction. I remember one story he wrote called Josephine the Singer, which is about a bunch of field mice. And there's a singer named Josephine. And the joke is she's a beautiful voice, but of course she's a mouse. So it's just cheap, cheap, cheap. I became interested in writing about the big themes. And, my earlier writing is kind of embarrassing because it's like everything was fraught with symbolism. That's what I thought that you had to do to write, that you had to write about alienation, big letters, and all my characters were frustrated novelists and things like that. And then, eventually you figure out you can write about anything. You don't necessarily have to write about big themes, and they will come out anyway. You don't have to hammer them in.
That's a really good point. I do feel like you don't need to intentionally add theme. It's just part of your voice, part of your fixations. And it's better if you just let it rise to the top like cream and not try to really insert it there. I know that A Wrinkle in Time was like a big book for you. You said it kind of taught you that you can draw outside the box, you can break the rules. So
yeah, Madeleine L'Engle, actually, if you have read her other stuff, she does a lot of really kooky stuff for being a young adult author. There's a book that she wrote that was turned into an absolutely awful movie. It was called A Ring of Endless Light, and it has to do with magical dolphins and things like that. But the way that she wrote is that she would occasionally break up the sentences like poetry and do things like that, that I think oftentimes people underestimate what young adult, like you can have experimental young adult novels. I mean, that's a possibility. They don't all have to be LOL, LOL and Riz and Skibbity or whatever kids are saying these days. It can actually be, like that. And that's one of the things that got me about Madeleine L'Engle. Also, the fact that a lot of her stuff is thematically about, she was a devout Christian, and it comes through her work, but her particular type of Christianity was about radical love rather than about, you need to be this way and you need to be that way. She was not, Jerry Falwell or anything.
I don't often think, when I think of Christian writers, think of such a emphasis on science. It's been a long time since I read her, but one of the books in that series is about like mitochondria, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and she has like a weird angel, and I love weird angels. I love a good weird angel. And she was the first one that sort of showed a biblically accurate angel in her fiction. And again, my mind was blown because I sort of lost my faith when I grew up for a variety of reasons. I think the primary reason that I lost faith is because a lot of people who are Christian are, no offense, but they're kind of jerks anyway. And it's just like, it doesn't seem to make them better. And so that was the thing that sort of threw me out of religion. But I also recognize I have a strong desire for the mystical side of things anyway. I kind of get it from that sort of, like I said, quote unquote, dark wonder thing, that sort of numinous feeling that I love, that a lot of people get from religion, is what I kind of get from, like, my religion is writing. I mean, it's kind of like my prayer, my version of prayer.
I love that. You just mentioned the weird angel in L'Engle's writing and this notion of dark mysticism. One of the things I noticed in your fiction is that genre slippery quality. And I often think of weird fiction as being a fiction that has a unique access to the numinous, to the ineffable. I think that's part of what separates it from other forms of speculative fiction. And you also mentioned the influence of Lovecraft on your work. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on whether you consider yourself a weird fiction writer and how you perceive what weird fiction is and what weird fiction does.
I think that maybe like a lot of writers, I just kind of view it as fiction. When people read it, they're just like, this is clearly weird fiction. I'm like, really? I just think it's a story. And I began to think of myself as a weird fiction actually when I won an award for weird fiction. I won something called the Joseph S. Pulver Award for Weird Fiction at the last Necronomicon. And I was just like, really? Huh? Let me sit with that. Okay, I can work with that. Why not? Because I never considered myself a horror writer. Even though a lot of my stuff is in that vein, I never really considered myself a fantasy writer, even though my stuff has a lot of magic in it. I want to say that there are two versions of weird fiction. There's the Lovecraft weird fiction, and then there's what I'm going to call the more Kelly Link side of weird fiction. And I think that I'm kind of like at that particular juncture. It's dark, but it also has a little bit of whimsy in there, and it's character based. The sort of magic comes from the character's perception as much as it does from the external supernatural intrusion of something.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I suppose character is not something we usually mention as one of the crowning virtues of Lovecraft's work as a fiction writer.
Right. They're all really the same guy. They're all the same guy.
They are all the same guy.
All scared.
Yeah, true. That resonates. I don't enter into a work of fiction thinking, I am now going to write a cosmic horror story. Like, it's just not how it works. You enter into a work and it sort of becomes what it becomes. You maybe will use certain imagery or certain tropes or certain ideas to express things within yourself, but it's not as if you're using them thinking, this is the category I would like the story to belong to. Does that resonate with you as well?
Absolutely. Part of the reason that sometimes I get into reading slumps is that a lot of books that get published, both indie and the big 5 or 4, whatever they are, a lot of them just fall into formulas. And it's like, this would be good if you just took this particular, why does there have to be this particular beat here? I don't like things where it's just like, I've hit this beat, I've hit this beat, I've hit this beat. I don't like fiction like that. I like fiction that is more passionate and primal. For instance, I love the idea of, what do you call them? Mashups. I would absolutely love to see a mashup of horror and romance because there's a lot of romance. There's a lot about falling in love that is horrific. And there's a lot about it that's beautiful, but it's also terrible too, because you discover things about either yourself or limits that your partner has. I think a lot of people are just like, this has to be a romance novel. This has to be this. This has to be the new thing is romantasy. It has to be romantasy. I was like, why can't you have a cozy horror novel? Why not?
Yeah, it's often the nexus between two genres or categories are more interesting. Kind of like building a nest, like you're a little bird who's pulling from here and there. And then there's maybe a couple genres. You don't want too much because it gets too busy, but maybe there's 2 or 3 different genres that you like a little bit of, and you'll borrow some of those tropes. But I agree with you. If someone's just trying for the sake of fitting into a category to hit certain beats, I always think that categories should be put on you by the bookseller who is trying to decide what section of their store to put you in, not yourself. I don't like to impose constraints on myself while writing. That's kind of the antithesis of writing passionately. So I would agree with you. Are there any genres that you have yet to work in that you would want to work in?
I haven't written it yet, but one of my ideas was to turn Lovecraftian monsters into like gay ballroom culture or something and sort of smush that in there. The gravy on top is that it would cause HP to turn in his grave. In many ways, it's just like, why is my monster, walking around in RuPaul's Drag Race or something? Why? It's because it's fun. It's fun. I kind of want to work on that. I want to do something like, this is a really weird genre. It's called Legatian horror. I think the reason that I'm sort of drawn into Legatian stuff is that when I read his stories, they're almost like, what is the word I'm looking for? They're Borgesian in many ways, like Borges, in that they're not quite fables, they're not quite philosophy. And character often isn't the point of a Legati story. In fact, Legati will say himself, I'm not one of these people that writes thinking about a character. And I love how that sort of frees him to talk about lots of different things. There's lots of different things that have happened, particularly in the age of Trump, that I realize that writing it like Legati would be a better way of addressing certain concepts. Like, there's a part of me that wants to write about. Are you familiar with the concept of enshittification?
Yeah.
Like, just the other day, I was perusing my Facebook, which, you know, Facebook. And I
Unfortunately.
saw all these, it's been flooded with AI and bots. And there's this theory called dead internet theory. And the idea is that the internet really isn't about people. It's about bots talking to bots, this constant parade of trying to sell you certain things. I think that there's a way in which I can write about that and also talk about, issues of race and marginalization. I'm gearing towards writing more sort of Legati-esque. I wouldn't even know what you would call it. What would you call it, Mike?
Legati, I suppose, existential, cosmic horror,
Yeah.
philosophical, right? I don't know. Yeah, he really is in his own. I mean, you've described him very well. Borgesian is another good descriptor, I think. You said a number of things that interested me just now. The thing you're gesturing to, that different forms of speculative fiction feel like the most intuitive way to write about reality right now, that really resonates with me. I don't know what writing realist fiction, quote unquote, realist literary fiction right now would look like. Reality's exceeding fiction or something. As you were talking, I was thinking, I'd love to read that book or that story. So I'm curious if you're working on anything right now. And if so, if you're at a point where you can talk about it or.
So Stephen King, for instance, has a tendency to write stories. And I think a lot of horror writers do this too, where the viewpoint is there's an intrusive force that's coming in that's going to destroy the entire world or something like that. What I am interested in is an intrusive force trying to destroy a tiny microcosm. I'm more into microcosms than I am into sort of save the world type fiction. Unless you're a president or something, you really don't get that in your real life. So I'm more interested in not even just small town fiction, but exploring various subcultures and seeing where the horror or the magic comes from there. So I've been writing stories about certain subcultures like furries and things like that, and exploring that sort of world. Because in many ways, it's just fascinating. And it's fascinating how these hierarchies develop even in the most bizarre settings. A good example is to talk about a contemporary issue. There's a big Me Too movement that's happening in writing. I won't mention the name of the big person who currently has the Eye of Sauron on them. It occurs to me that it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Even in quote unquote progressive, there are people who do the exact same thing. And I'm just fascinated by how human nature, both bad and good, can manifest in even places that we consider safe spaces.
I think that's really interesting and pressing, and that's very Gidney of you. I do notice when I read your stuff that there are like these really highly detailed settings, characters with a lot of backstory, and is like a big draw or appeal to your writing, that sort of world building? And if so, how much of it happens inside of the story, and how much do you maybe use character sheets or maps or anything like that, like secondary material to help supplement these worlds that you're building?
Well, I'll use the example of Idiolate, for instance, that particular story that we were talking about. That came from the fact that I was actually in the fringes of the goth scene, mostly in Washington, D.C., even though the story is set in Baltimore. And I was just obsessed with the way that it arranged itself. What is it like to be a person of color in a mostly white space, and particularly with gothic stuff? It's super white. I mean, the pancake makeup, the whole European sort of thing, and how you sort of fit yourself in there, and how Black Goths do fit themselves in there. So one of the things that I have been doing is that I've been doing a lot of nonfiction reading about subcultures and trying to understand certain subcultures. I'm interested in like African American heavy metal people, as it turns out. I mean, I'm just fascinated by people who find certain things. Like, did you know that I know that you're into heavy metal?
Hmm.
So, did you know that there are these South African heavy metal people? There's this
No.
band of Black South African heavy metal people, and they sing about, apartheid and things like that, and they
Whoa.
they go the entire 9 yards, and it's just like as heavy as anything from black metal as you can get. I mean, the traditional black metal as you can get. I'm also fascinated by things like black metal, the subculture. I find it both horrifying and amazing how certain ideas proliferate. Like, for instance, a lot of black metal, not black people metal, but black metal is, about sort of Odinism and that sort of thing. Some of them go into that, and then the anti-Christian. Sometimes they're anti-black, but sometimes they're not. I just find that sort of stuff fascinating, and how people find each other. And that's one of the things that I would love to explore, and what I would absolutely love to read about. I read a book published by my publisher of Spectral Hue called Corpse Paint. It's a novel set in the black metal scene, and it was just absolutely amazing to me because it was philosophical and dark. He obviously did the work, and he actually didn't shy away from talking about the more salacious aspects of it, that some people are white supremacists in there. Some people do lots of drugs and completely fuck themselves up in trying to create music. The supernatural element is there, but it's not the main thrust of the book.
Yeah, your story Etiolate was incredible. It did feel to me like you were kind of interrogating down to a granular level the way bodies inhabit these very specific spaces. Like I said, that story really stunned me. And it sounds like some of the research you're doing is maybe somewhat adjacent to some of the things that story was doing. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I became obsessed with the sort of black metal movement, not necessarily because of the music, though some of the music I actually do like, especially the symphonic styles. There's this writer who I actually took a course with. Her name is Elizabeth Hand. She wrote a book, is a part of her mystery series, the Casneri Mysteries. And the second book, Black Light, is set in the black metal scene in Iceland. And it's just absolutely amazing how she did that, and how granular, that's a good word that you used, granular she got with it. It's just absolutely amazing. The Casneri books are marketed as thriller, but there's a kind of spooky aspect to it. It's not supernatural, but it could only be written by someone who is well versed in supernatural fiction, if you know what I mean. Like no outwardly magical things. That's another thing that I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with sort of fantasy novels that have no magic in them. I love those ideas. There's this writer named Erin Morgenstein. She wrote a book called The Starless Sea. It's magical and there's magic in it, but I can't explain it. It's like this insaturation type of fantasy that I like.
I definitely relate to that. I like things in which nothing overtly magical is happening, but the atmosphere is really heavy with something. I don't know if you've read E.T.A. Hoffmann. It's like a German romanticist.
Yeah, I think I have.
He wrote like The Golden Pot. He read The Sandman, which Freud uses in his essay on the Uncanny. I'm interested in the breakdown of the human mind, things that may or may not be real. I really want to read Elizabeth Hand now. She was already on my radar. I know she teaches in Maine, which is really close to where we live in New Brunswick. And now I'm very enticed to check out these spooky, thrilling mysteries.
Cass Neary is a punk photographer. She had her heyday by taking pictures of punk musicians at CBGB's, the New York scene, and then she got involved in drugs and sort of fell down the thing. She's a mystery solver, but she's also not a good person too. So I love that aspect as well. She's not exactly an anti-hero. Like she steals people's medicines and things like that. Not all heroes are perfect. Some heroes are flawed. That's another thing that I kind of want to explore. I want to more explore dark psychology of people. Not necessarily criminal, but it goes back to that obsession with Ligotti. I think that Ligotti's stuff, it's not the feel good
No.
feel good read of the century, but at the same time, it is full of such wonder and you get such understandings of humanity. One of the things that we do as horror writers or people who write dark fiction, let's just call it that, we explore a part of the human psyche that a lot of people go out of their way to pretend doesn't exist.
I do find dark psychology very interesting. You're right. I think most horror writers are dark fiction writers. That's something that just never goes away. Always fascinated and want to know more.
If I were ever to be a teacher, one of the things that I would do is that I would definitely put something like Lovecraft on my syllabus. This fantasy writer, Sophia Samatar, she's part Somalian. And she says, I teach Lovecraft because it's like a stroll through a diseased mind and you understand what's going on. When I picked up the book that I threw across the room, one of the things that I thought was fascinating is that all of his neuroses are right there. It's ugly, but it's right there. And you understand certain things happen. So he, for instance, had an allergy to shellfish and seafood. So he turned them into monsters. He was obsessed with miscegenation. Well, in my humble opinion, I think that he was both attracted and disgusted at the same time. I think that he didn't have a traditional sexuality either. I think he was probably ace, if not ace leaning towards homo, whatever. But he was ace, definitely. And he had a fear of sex. He was sickly. So you can also understand disease. Both of his parents died in asylums. So you can understand this obsession with genetics, and I just find that absolutely fascinating. I don't know if I'd like to hang out with him, but it is an interesting thing. And that's the same fascination I had with Flannery O'Connor, in that her version of Christianity, her works are explicitly Christian, but her version of Christianity is really dark and weird. A lot of people don't understand that. Her version of Catholicism is almost Cthulhu-like. It's like God is just this weird force that can do bad things or good things at any point, you know? Like her story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. The serial killer is just like, she would have been a good woman if someone had been there to shoot her all the rest of the day of her life, because the grandmother is a terrible person, is absolutely terrible in that. And I just absolutely love exploring this sort of dark side of people, because I actually think that there's something weirdly hopeful about it.
Yeah, that's such an intelligent and rigorous reading of Lovecraft. You're unpacking so much there. I mean, the thing with reading Lovecraft is I think you can't just ignore his racism. It's there, like as you're indicating very astutely and articulately, it's unavoidable. It's so embedded in the work that, you have to, as you say, kind of wrangle with this diseased mind in order to understand what the fiction is doing.
And one of the things that I want to bring up is we've been getting a lot of pushback about diversity, and particularly diversity in fantasy and blah blah. It's woke and it's this, that, and the other. The thing that always bothers me about this sort of too much diversity, that sort of argument, is that it's really, to me, all about granularity, meaning that when I read, let's say, a literary book about a white professor who has an affair with their student, if it's well written, I'll read it, but I'll view it as that's a particular culture. That isn't the default. It's a particular culture. I actually loved Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections, because he got the zeitgeist of sort of upper middle class waspiness in a way that other people couldn't get. I mean, he's kind of a jerk, but his book caught it so perfectly that I'm just like, that's what you have to do. You have to be specific. I guess in your fiction, is there a Canadianness about your writing you feel that is sort of ineffable, but there?
Yeah, no, I think so. Certainly, like my embodied experience in my environment, it informs my writing, whether I'm conscious of it or not. And I think writers need to recognize that.
And the other thing that I sort of noticed too is that a lot of people, a lot of editors, for instance, I've heard this from a lot of people of color writers, will say is that they won't understand certain references in the fiction. And I'm kind of the opinion that if I don't understand the nuance of it, I still want the thing in there, because eventually I'll understand the nuance. There is something very specific about, for instance, reading a book by a female author that you will get that a male author can't get. I couldn't write it, but they do it perfectly. It's not even about who's allowed to tell the story. There's just a perspective that's there. I look at something like, for instance, Atwood's work. If she wasn't a woman, I don't think that those things would come out. There's a dystopian thing, but there's something very specific about how she wrote about it. And the very specificity of The Handmaid's Tale, one of the things that I liked about it was the way it's written is that it's written like a diary or an apocalyptic log. And one of the things that got me was this little thing where Fred goes to the brothel or whatever. And the commander is just like, is there anything special that I could give you? And she says, yes, you can give me lotion. And there's something about the specificity of that thing. It's horrifying, but it's like a window into certain things, that you wouldn't get otherwise.
Yeah, definitely.
There's all this talk of, AI is going to start writing books and and people are going to, I know exactly, because of what you're saying. It's like you have to have a perspective, and personal history and memory to write. Like, it's not interesting to think of something written by no one or everyone, if you're considering it feeding all of our stuff into that. But yeah, I agree with you, Craig. I think people say writing helps with building empathy, and it's just exciting to read everything, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm also not one of these people that says that you can't write it, but there are certain things, like for instance, there's this writer, and she actually lives near me. Her name is Haley Piper, and she's a horror writer. She's trans, and I think she won the Stoker one year. Her book was Queen of Teeth, and it's basically vagina dentata. And the thing that's amazing is that having that from a trans woman's perspective, I don't think a cis woman could write the same way that she did.
More voices, always a good thing. More perspectives, more stories. I mean, that's that's what we all want, I would hope. That's
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
I was wondering if you've read anything recently that's particularly excited you.
I went through a reading slump, to tell the truth, because, well, there are a variety of reasons. Life intervened. But the last books that I read really blew my socks off. One is called Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. She wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Her new book, Piranesi, is completely magical, but it's also philosophical at the same time. It's just absolutely amazing. And there's so many layers. And she did it in a short amount of time. That's another thing that I'm obsessed with, which is short novels and novellas and things like that. I'm absolutely adoring the fact that novellas are having their day in the sun, because I find that a lot of really big works, sometimes they repeat themselves and you're tired of it, or it's the same character, they add more characters. It's sort of like the Game of Thrones guy. I think he kind of fell out of love with what he was writing for a variety of reasons. And that's why the Winds of Winter are held up, is because there's just too much to do to wrap it up. And I love a story that can wrap up. I like single volume sort of things. I admire people who write 50 books set in the same milieu. I just don't have that in me. Are you familiar with Sylvia Moreno Garcia? She's Mexican Canadian, and I think she lives in Vancouver. And every book she does is completely different from the other. So she'll do a science fiction book, she'll do a romantasy book. It's just amazing that she's allowed to do that. And that's kind of what my dream is. I don't want to be one of those people that it's just like you have to write the same thing over and over and over.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you seem to have a lot of curiosity, and it requires as sustenance all kinds of different things. So it's nice to switch it up, and whatever fixation or themes you have, just put them into a new place. Do you have any like fixations, I guess, like themes that always come up in your writing?
Well, there was this meme going around for a while, and I think it was on Facebook, where it's just like a Mike Thorne story is, where a character is wrestling with toxic masculinity. Well, a Craig Gidney story is someone finds something beautiful and then they get obsessed with it and they either go crazy or they become creative. That's kind of where I go. My core belief in my approach to sort of writing dark fiction is I think that a lot of horror stuff, they're into like gross stuff. I think that people would be entranced by something and search for some deeper meaning rather than just be cruel for cruel's sake. I think that there is a space and a time for that sort of cruel stuff. And I think there are people that do it really well, like Stephen Graham Jones, for instance. He does slashers really well. But that's not my sort of thing. I think that Most people think that they're doing something good, but they get tricked into doing something evil, or they become addicted. Addiction does something. There's a whole bunch of addiction horror books that are coming out. Unfortunately, this has happened in the United States because of women's health care has been put on the chopping block. A lot of horror novels are coming out about motherhood and about these sorts of things. It's like spooning for gold in the collective unconscious to find out what's going on there. A lot of trans authors are writing these kick-ass horror novels that are just like, hey, I have body dysphoria. I'm going to put it on the page and make it as extreme as possible. And I love that. I absolutely love that.
Horror is such an exciting space for that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It can be so confrontational by virtue of its excesses. The genre allows you to do things that other genres just don't. And I would say the same for fantasy. As we've been saying, your fiction, I don't think does fall neatly into one category, but you're certainly pulling on some of the tools that, say, fantasy, horror, sci-fi, spec fic broadly, whatever that means. I do see you using genre as a tool in your own work, which is, to me, what genre should be. I always think of it as an opening, not an enclosure. It's like, no, it's not a container. It opens your work. Before we let you go, Craig, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me at my website, craiglaurencegidney.com. And I am Ethereal Lad, one word, in Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thank you so much. Seriously, it's such a pleasure to talk with you.
This has been really exciting.